I'm Hayden Ludwig. Just a few short years ago, the U.S. Army informed the Biden administration it was cutting shell production because artillery, they said, had lost its preeminence on the battlefield. 8 months later, Russia invaded Ukraine, and artillery became responsible for 80% of casualties on both sides. Now the Army says they're scrambling to expand shell production. At the start of the war, no army had used cheap suicide drones in anger. Today, both sides pump out perhaps 50,000 each month to devastating effect. Yet America still lags woefully behind. Why? Here to answer that question and more is Will Thibeau, a U.S. Army Ranger veteran and director of the Claremont Institute's American Military Project. Will, thanks for joining the Restoration Spotlight podcast.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with drones. It's an issue you've raised in your writing for Restoration News. And you write, for the cost of one Gerald R. Ford-class supercarrier, about $13 billion, the military could buy 600,000 cheap one-way drones. Will, walk us through your thinking here and why the military doesn't seem to share it.
Hayden, this is about learning lessons from the modern battlefield and understanding that the battlefield of the 21st century will look much different than the kinds of spaces that brought about the necessity for aircraft carriers. Long gone are the days of carrier-based flight intercepts and attack squadrons of propeller and jet aircraft. What is necessary now for investment is an appreciation for the kinds of systems that are making the big difference in the battlefields ongoing as we speak. In Ukraine, in particular, unmanned systems have revolutionized the dynamic on the front lines. Russia and Ukraine both launch and deliver about 40,000 first-person view cheap attritable drones per month. Those kinds of drones are responsible for 80% of casualties on both sides of the front lines. And so I wrote that comparison between the aircraft carrier and the drone, not to necessarily say that we should sell our aircraft carriers or decommission them, but to say there has to be this dual appreciation for what unmanned systems can do on the battlefield. That's why this kind of investment in unmanned systems is so important at this stage.
In other words, what aircraft carriers did to battleships in the Second World War, drones could potentially do to aircraft carriers in the Third World War.
Right. And this is, I think, where the United States military needs to learn a lesson the easy way, without having to put Americans on the front lines and learn them the hard way. We should understand that there are certain capabilities necessary to compete in the 21st century. Unmanned systems are certainly one of those. Just look at maritime capabilities. Ukraine more or less scuttled the Russian Black Sea fleet with explosive-laden autonomous jet skis. Maybe a few dozen of them.
Wow.
That is a paradigm shift in maritime power, and it's one that the United States needs to rapidly adopt, not simply research and innovate on, but integrate and deploy for war if it comes to our shores.
Now, what's so surprising about this, Will, is that America pioneered military drone aircraft decades ago. I mean, we all remember the famous images of these Reaper drones flying over the skies of Iraq or Afghanistan. And yet what you're saying is a completely different kind of drone. Sounds like much more akin to what we would buy at home here, but lethal and designed to go one direction towards the enemy. How did we lose that advantage? And maybe give us a comparison between the two types of aircraft.
Well, it's a great point, Hayden. And I think the Reaper or the MQ-9, as it's known in some instances, is still the kind of revoking image of which Americans think when they hear about drones in the military. And you still need a Reaper drone. You still need drones that can be flown from Las Vegas, that can fly for over 24 hours and take exquisite imagery and provide pretty exceptional surveillance. But again, there's a new class of systems on the line. It's defined by a few characteristics. First is cost. These are affordable systems. A drone that causes this rate of casualties in Ukraine and Russia, in Ukraine and Russia, it's probably $500 to $700 because they use cheap Chinese components. For America, it's probably going to be $2,000+. But even still, that is again a paradigm shift in the kinds of hardware that the military adopts for kinetic effects. The second is this word I've used already, attritable. Attritable being an inclination or comfort with not getting the drone back upon use. Ideally for intelligence collection, for, again, destructive kinetic effects, as we call it. But an inclination, a drone, frankly, it's a strategic incident if the U.S. loses an MQ-9. It should be a Tuesday if an American Army unit loses an FPV drone, because we have to have the mindset to be able to test and adopt them at the scale and frequency required for relevance and skill proficiency. These are just a few of the differences. The final one being an MQ-9 is an asset that's controlled by a general, 3-4-star general. Oftentimes, a first-person view drone, a cheap, attritable one-way attack system should be controlled by a lieutenant or a captain, something that, again, redefines the front line of troops, not just the strategic assets at the disposal of a commanding general.
Yeah, I want to stick with this point, too. You had mentioned aircraft carriers and what a threat these attritable drones are potentially to aircraft carriers. Of course, nobody's ever seen this yet. This is still theoretical, and it's something we worry about. Let's imagine for a moment a sea and air war between the United States and the People's Republic of China. Give us an example of how the Chinese might use these mass FPV attritable drones to attack our air and naval forces.
That's exactly what they would do. They would mass effects in a place or in a way that overwhelms U.S. defensive capability. And this is where an incident or an instance, more recently, like the conflict with the Houthis in the off the coast of Yemen, is
Correct,
instructive. Yes. When I was in the Army, we would try and master a concept called battlefield geometry, or in other words, the ability to array an assault force in relation to a support by fire element in a way that allows maximum duration of coverage fire while the assault force moves into position, right? You got to get that geometry right so you have positive effects on the enemy. There's another equation that I don't think the U.S. military is grasping quite yet. Well, perhaps they grasp it, but they're not operationalizing it. And that is battlefield algebra. How do you destroy expensive assets of the enemy with cheap things of your own? And we have that backwards. The Houthis were firing $5,000 to $10,000 missiles at commercial ships and sometimes our own destroyers, and we were shooting them down with, even at the cheapest, $250,000 to $400,000 missiles, sometimes even $1 million to $2.5 million missiles. And so this is again an inversion of the battlefield algebra that I think China will try to exploit in the event of a conventional naval conflict.
Well, and that Houthi conflict, let's point out, tied up two aircraft carriers, carrier groups, or I should say, to take care of. That wasn't even a major war. That's a fight with guerrillas in a backwards country. We're talking about, how powerful these could be used against a state actor that knows exactly what it's doing, has been training for this for years against us. That's why it's a big threat. Is that right?
Precisely. And it is a sign of how real the trade-offs are when you consider the allocation of U.S. forces around the world. If we spend 2 carrier strike groups to, frankly, not even defeat Houthi rebels, that is a problem, especially when the Indo-Pacific theater is so maritime dominant. But I think there, again, needs to be even more consideration of just what a confrontation with China might look like. There's a war game that the Center for Strategic International Studies released, CSIS,
yes,
where they claimed a United States victory in this war game over Taiwan. When you actually read the war game, though, it was a quote-unquote victory that involved 15,000 dead American service members, an aircraft carrier at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, and a whole host of U.S. combat forces directly committed on Taiwan. I just don't think that's in the cards politically, strategically, militarily. I don't think we should plan for a head-on-head conventional military confrontation with the People's Republic of China. I think, though, we can build in a credible deterrent and, if necessary, a credible offensive capability through the development and production of unmanned systems at the kind of scale required to make any Chinese incursion on our interests in the Pacific really, really painful.
You brought up an excellent point. Losing an aircraft carrier carrying 6,000 sailors and airmen is a massive problem. Aviators, I should say, is a massive problem. That's not exactly a victory. That's what they call a Pyrrhic victory. That's what nobody wants. And yet that's what the best case scenarios of these war games have. And they, by the way, they say we win if it wraps up in 3 to 4 weeks. Because, as you know, that's when we run out of these multi-million-dollar missile stockpiles. How are we supposed to win if a war could go on for years with a major power if we have stockpiles that get us through a few weeks or even months in the best case scenario, Will?
It's a great question, Hayden. And this is the kind of diversity of which I support. We need to diversify military assets available both to ourselves and to Taiwan right now. Again, I don't think it's realistic to expect a credible deployment of U.S. conventional military power after China has invaded or pursued a cross-strait military invasion of Taiwan. I think that's a fool's errand. I think it's perhaps even suicidal. What is required now is to develop the kinds of capabilities that can perhaps be delivered covertly, that can be deployed at scale really simply from geographic offset, so that, as folks want, Taiwan can become a genuine porcupine, and that any Chinese military movement on the island can be painful for them, so painful that they're not willing to take the step in the first place. And then, you'll still need hypersonic missiles. You'll still need cruise missiles if the U.S. chooses to be involved militarily, which, again, is a whole nother question. But you then have other capabilities that build in redundancy and stockpiles so that we're not so dependent on the deployment of a certain kind of military force.
I'm glad you mentioned hypersonic missiles. That is a very good example of a capability where the United States is not leaps and bounds ahead of the Chinese. If anything, we might be behind the Chinese, although, of course, you're the expert. You'd know better than I would. Let's talk about building off the conversation about drones. What other weaknesses would U.S. forces face in a war with, let's say, Iran, Russia, China, any of our potential competitors that worry you the most, besides drones, I mean?
So hypersonics are certainly one of them. I mean, if you look at the Russians in particular, they have clearly developed the capability to strike with precision, at long range from air and ground-based systems in ways that I don't know the Americans can necessarily appreciate without getting on the ground. And this is, the long range precision strike capability, even a guided rocket that moves fast, that can outpace a fighter jet or any other kind of interceptor. That's not necessarily a threat that the Americans have faced. But my fear kind of goes to your the previous few questions, in our weakness being the ability to sustain high intensity conflict across weeks, perhaps months, especially given the current state of our defense industrial base. That's a whole nother conversation. I think if President Trump's recent his recent strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities show, the United States still possesses immense firepower and capability that can be deployed at scale with precision, kind of at the blink of an eye, and perhaps with some stealth capability too. My issue is when you have to replicate that kind of operation and that kind of kinetic effects, 10 and 15 times over in order to defeat a more capable, formidable adversary that has not been attrited by the IDF in the case
Yes.
of Iran. These are the kind of considerations that I think DoD planners are thinking about as they undergo preparations for the future.
Another thing that the DoD planners are thinking about under this administration, certainly because they weren't in the last one, is physical fitness standards. Now, Will, you have been a major advocate, working with us, I should add, too, to try and reverse the decades-long decline in the physical fitness standards of all of our service members, including those in frontline combat, where you would hope they'd be the most physically ready to go and confront the enemy here. One of the big things that President Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth have done almost from the minute they came in was try to raise those combat standards. But of course, we know that's going to take more than a couple years, maybe even more than one presidential administration to work out. Give us a 30,000-foot view from your perspective as a veteran about how these standards have declined relative to those in China and Russia and other major countries, and what the current administration is doing to reverse that decline.
Well, let's first talk about how war has looked for the last 25 years. Now, there are a lot of exceptions, some heroic, immense missions that American units underwent in Iraq and Afghanistan since those respective invasions, and it's not to discount the immense physical toll that it took on the soldiers and Marines in particular who fought in them. But by and large, we fought those wars out of FOBs and combat outposts to some extent that, kind of changed the nature of the fitness required to actually partaking in ground combat. Even for myself, if we went on a mission one night, we would, leave under the cover of darkness, fly helicopters, drive or walk, conduct a mission, and then get back on the helicopters in the trucks or walk back and, sleep in our same beds, when we got home. And, there was not always, if ever, the occasion for sustained, patrols or combat operations in a degraded environment. Again, I'm talking broad strokes here.
Sure.
And so that's different than, say, the Vietnam War, World War II, where you had months and years spent in patrol bases, conventional movements against the enemy in order to trade space. The fitness test, I think, has become, on one hand, it was this kind of baseline measure of excellence that was as much an indication of discipline and toughness and preparation as it was a specific physical skill. The Army since has tried to strike that balance, has tried to measure the kinds of activities you would do in ground combat, like lift heavy weight, climb into a window and other things. But it has done so in an environment of equal opportunity and diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yes.
Where now women are, until recently, graded on a different scale than men, even while we are told that women should have the same exact job opportunities as men in the military, right? It's this dissonance that doesn't really add up. Again, during the Biden administration, frankly, up until the Biden administration through it, a woman would have to get 42 push-ups on the Army fitness test to get an A+, and a man would have to get 84 push-ups to get an A+. And it was that A+ that went on your report card, so to speak. And so this is, I think, as much of a cultural signifier of decay and something that is, again, just as culturally important to rectify for President Trump and Secretary Hegseth.
And we know that the military has been experimenting with women in combat going back to the Clinton administration. We're both aware of studies that the Marine Corps has done as recently as 10 years ago that showed an abysmal result for women in these high-stress conditions where it's an extended patrol, potentially weeks out in the field with very poor, unhygienic conditions. And the results are horrifying, and the Clinton administration buried many of these results. Maybe you can talk more about that.
Right, Hayden. I think you're referencing a 2015 study published by the RAND Corporation that examined the relative performance of Marine Corps infantry units. The Marine Corps essentially took a cohort of women, treated them like professional athletes for up to a year, giving them the nutrition, physical fitness training, and combat training that they needed to succeed, inputted those women into combat environments, combat training environments, and then measured everything from marksmanship to casualty evacuation procedures to tactical considerations. And almost by and large, with the exception of kind of amorphous metrics like creativity, but almost across the board, sex segregated combat units outperformed sex integrated combat units.
Wow.
Nonetheless, as we all know, the Obama administration still removed the combat exclusion policy, against all available evidence, that Marine Corps study and many others, in the hopes of making sure that the military represented the politics and ideologies of our nation writ large.
Yes, in other words, it wasn't following the science. It wasn't what we now call DEI. This is 10 years ago, but diversity, equity, and inclusion. It is lowering the standard to allow in political groups for political reasons, for with an ideological motive about all of this. You've done a lot pointing out how President Trump and Secretary Hegseth are rolling back DEI at these 5 service academies, West Point, where you're a graduate, right? One of the problems that we see here, though, is that a lot of the superintendents who were responsible and trusted by the Biden administration for implementing these DEI policies, I want to be clear, these are not people following orders from a general. These are people who are put in place because they're advocates for the DEI, critical race theory kind of woke policies we're talking about. Now, some of them have been removed, but many of them are still in the same positions, including the leader at West Point, who's now apparently been tasked with undoing the woke policies that he helped put into place. I'm sure I'm simplifying here, Will, but talk to us about that and what's being done to counter that, and also, your involvement in messaging the administration here about why this is such a big deal.
A modest correction. I'm not a West Pointer myself, but I'm married to one, so I want to make sure I
my mistake.
Get that on the record. No, it's all good. But I love the institution. I admire it. It's a necessary institution for the military and for American life, I think, writ large. There should be an institution of military professionalism and excellence that can also, again, be an institution of manhood and making good Americans who can lead in the military and in society writ large. But to your point, Hayden, West Point in particular has been the epicenter of DEI in the military. Even going back to 1965, when Secretary of Defense at the time, Robert McNamara, mandated that the military be the forging institution to embrace the principles of the Civil Rights Act, namely that you can assume injustice if the proportional representation of a given organization does not match that of the nation writ large. West Point was the first place to have quotas for race that would make the Ivy League blush.
Affirmative action.
Right, exactly. Affirmative action by a different name. And even until January 19th of 2025, West Point had a diversity and inclusion studies degree. West Point. And this is a sign that there's a lot more to the institutional problem of diversity, equity, and inclusion than the political appointees or who the president is. This has become an institutional sickness that must be eradicated. And it's not necessarily to assign personal animus to the superintendent of West Point, but it is to, I think, acknowledge reality that if a commanding general is asked to implement the most extreme DEI policies that the military has ever seen, then we should ask a different person to implement the undoing of those exact same policies.
Yes, exactly.
But we're in this weird way where generals are now expected to defend both sides of a coin that doesn't exist. Again, not necessarily out of animus, but I don't think we should ask these military leaders to do so. We should send them on their way and let others who are more capable and aligned to do the job of restoring the military.
Fascinating. Well, Will Thibeau, we're grateful for all your time and incredible insights here today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Hayden. Thanks for all the work you do.
I'm Hayden Ludwig, and this is the Restoration Spotlight Podcast, project of Restoration News, your source of headline-smashing investigative journalism for the America First movement. Check us out at restoration-news.com. Until next time, stay vigilant and trust in God.